The wind over Winterfell was cold and sharp, carrying the smell of blood and wet earth. The battle had ended, but the ground still looked like a nightmare. Bodies were scattered everywhere, banners torn, armor broken, and the snow had turned dark in many places. The men who were still alive walked slowly through the field, searching for friends, brothers, and sometimes enemies who might still be breathing. Somewhere in the middle of that terrible field, under a pile of fallen soldiers, a hand suddenly twitched. It was Jon Snow. His chest struggled to rise as if the air itself was heavy. Dirt filled his mouth and nose, and for a moment he didn't know where he was. Everything felt dark and quiet, like he was still trapped in a dream. Then pain came rushing back into his body. His ribs burned. His arms felt weak, but he was alive. He pushed slowly, moving the bodies off him one by one. The armor above him slid away with a dull thud. Jon coughed hard, pulling cold air into his lungs. The sky above him was grey, the kind of sky that promised more snow. He remembered the chaos. The charge of the cavalry, the screaming, Ramsay's soldiers surrounding them like a tightening cage. The moment he thought he would die when the bodies crushed him and the air disappeared. But somehow, fate had refused to let him go. Jon sat up slowly. His sword was gone. His cloak was torn. Blood covered his armor, though he could not tell how much of it was his own. Not far away, a few Stark soldiers noticed movement. "Seven hells, Lord Snow," one of them shouted. Two men ran toward him, disbelief on their faces. They helped him stand, though his legs shook badly. "We thought you were dead," one soldier said quietly. Jon looked across the battlefield. Men from the north were gathering, some were cheering, some were just staring in silence, still trying to understand what had happened. "Ramsay," Jon whispered. "He's gone," the soldier replied. "Captured." The Bolton men surrendered when the Knights of the Vale arrived. Jon closed his eyes for a moment, relief mixed with exhaustion. The battle had nearly destroyed them all. If help had arrived a little later, Winterfell would still belong to Ramsay Bolton. And Jon Snow would truly be dead. The soldiers helped him walk toward the castle gates. Winterfell stood strong again, its stone walls rising above the snow like a silent witness to the war. But victory did not feel joyful. As Jon approached the gate, he saw Sansa Stark waiting there. Her expression was calm, but her eyes were sharp and full of thoughts she hadn't spoken yet. When she saw Jon walking toward her alive, her face changed. For a moment she looked shocked. "I thought," she began, then stopped. Jon gave a tired smile. "So did I." They stood quietly for a few seconds, the cold wind moving around them. Sansa studied him carefully. "You shouldn't have charged alone." Jon looked away toward the battlefield. "I couldn't let him kill Rickon." A shadow crossed Sansa's face. The pain of losing their brother still hung heavy between them. "I know," she said softly, "but Ramsay wanted you to do exactly that." Jon nodded slowly, "And I gave him what he wanted." The gate behind them opened with a deep creak. Northern soldiers were bringing prisoners inside. Among them, tied and beaten, but still smirking slightly, was Ramsay Bolton. When Ramsay saw Jon alive, his smile faded. "That's impossible," Ramsay muttered. Jon stopped walking and stared at him. For a moment, the two enemies said nothing. The air between them felt colder than the winter wind. "You lost," Jon said quietly. Ramsay tilted his head, though his confidence looked weaker now. "Maybe today." Jon didn't answer. He simply turned and continued walking into Winterfell. Inside the courtyard, the surviving soldiers were gathering. Some were cheering for House Stark. Others simply looked tired beyond words. Jon looked at them all. These men had followed him into what looked like certain death. Many of their friends now lay frozen outside the walls. He suddenly realized something heavy. The North believed in him. They saw him as their leader now, maybe even their king. Jon felt the weight of that thought pressing on his shoulders, harder than any armor. He had survived the battle, but surviving meant something dangerous. It meant the story wasn't over. Far from the north, greater threats were already rising. The dead were marching beyond the wall, and in the south, powerful rulers were watching the north closely. Jon Snow had escaped death again. But sometimes surviving a battle only leads to a much bigger war. And deep down, Jon could feel it. Winter was not just coming. It had already begun. The night after the battle felt strangely quiet. Winterfell was full of men again, but the usual noise of victory was missing. Most soldiers were too tired to celebrate. Many were sitting near fires in the courtyard, silently staring into the flames. Others were drinking quietly, remembering the friends they had lost only hours ago. The cold wind moved through the broken banners hanging on the walls, and the castle felt heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. Jon Snow stood alone on the battlements, looking out at the dark fields where the battle had taken place. Snow had already begun to fall again, slowly covering the bodies that still waited to be burned. The battlefield looked peaceful now, almost as if the land itself was trying to forget the horror. But Jon could not forget. His ribs still ached every time he breathed. His hands were bruised and cut, yet the physical pain was nothing compared to the thoughts inside his mind. He had almost died again. He could still remember the moment when the pile of bodies crushed him and the air disappeared. For a moment, he had felt the same cold darkness he remembered from the night the mutineers of the Night's Watch killed him. Death had come close once more. Footsteps approached behind him. Still brooding, like always, I see. Jon turned and saw Tormund Giantsbane walking toward him, holding a cup of ale in one hand. The wildling leader looked tired, his beard messy and his armor scratched from the battle, but he was smiling like a man who had survived another impossible day. "You should be resting," Tormund said. Jon gave a small shrug. "Could say the same to you." Tormund leaned against the stone wall beside him and looked out at the snowy field. "That was a bloody mess out there," he muttered. "I've fought giants, Thenns, and White Walkers, but I've never seen men crush each other like that." Jon nodded slowly. "We almost lost," he said quietly. Tormund snorted. "Almost doesn't matter, we didn't." For a moment, they both stood in silence. Then Tormund glanced at Jon. "The North is talking." Jon raised an eyebrow. "About what?" "You." Jon frowned slightly. "What about me?" Tormund laughed a little. "They're saying the bastard of Winterfell led them to victory. They're saying you came back from the dead and still fought like a madman. To them, that sounds like the kind of man who should lead the North." Jon looked uncomfortable. "I'm not a king," he said. "That's what you said about being Lord Commander," Tormund replied. "And look how that turned out." Jon didn't answer. He knew Tormund wasn't wrong. Below in the courtyard, northern lords were gathering in the great hall. They had been arriving all evening, leaders of houses that had fought beside Jon in the battle. The Mormonts, the Hornwoods, the Mazzins, the Serwyns, and others. They weren't gathering just to celebrate. They were deciding the future of the North. Jon sighed and turned away from the battlements. "I suppose they're waiting for me." Tormund grinned. "Aye, and if you try to run away, I'll drag you there myself." Jon gave a tired smile before walking toward the stairs. Inside the great hall, torches burned along the walls, casting long shadows across the room. The hall was packed with northern lords, soldiers, and banners of many houses. The air smelled of smoke, sweat, and damp fur cloaks. When Jon entered, the room slowly grew quiet. All eyes turned toward him. At the far end of the hall stood Sansa Stark, watching everything carefully. Beside her stood Lyanna Mormont, the young lady of Bear Island, whose sharp gaze made many grown men uncomfortable. Jon walked forward slowly, unsure what to expect. Then Lyanna Mormont stepped forward. She looked small compared to the armored men around her, but her voice carried across the entire hall. "Your father was Eddard Stark," she said firmly, "but your father's name doesn't matter." The room stayed silent as she continued. "Your blood doesn't matter. The North remembers who fought for it, The North remembers who risked his life to save it. She pointed directly at Jon. You fought for us, you fought for Winterfell, you fought when others hid behind their walls. Several lords began nodding in agreement. Lyanna's voice grew stronger. House Mormont remembers, the North remembers, we know no king but the king in the North whose name is Stark. The room exploded with voices. King in the North, someone shouted. Then another. King in the North. Soon the entire hall was shouting the same words. Jon stood frozen. He looked toward Sansa, unsure what to do. Sansa watched him carefully. Her expression was calm, but there was something thoughtful in her eyes. Slowly, she knelt. The entire hall followed. King in the North, they shouted again. Jon Snow looked around at the kneeling lords of the North, feeling the weight of their loyalty pressing down on him like the cold winter sky. He had survived the battle. But now something even more dangerous had happened. The North had chosen him. And far beyond Winterfell, enemies were already preparing for the rise of the new king in the North. The shouting in the great hall slowly faded, but the feeling in the room did not disappear. The Northern lords were still kneeling, their heads lowered toward Jon Snow. The torches flickered along the stone walls, and their light danced across the faces of the men who had just declared a new king. Jon stood still in the middle of the hall, almost frozen, as if he had not fully understood what had just happened. Only hours ago, he had been buried under a mountain of bodies on the battlefield, struggling to breathe and certain he would die. Now the entire North was kneeling before him. Jon looked towards Sansa again. She remained kneeling with the others, her face calm but serious. Slowly Jon stepped forward and spoke, his voice quieter than the cheering that had filled the hall moments earlier. He told them they should rise, that he had never asked to be king and never expected such a thing. But the Northern lords did not seem to care about what he had expected. To them, the choice had already been made. They had seen Jon lead them into battle. They had seen him refuse to abandon the fight even when it looked hopeless. To these men, courage and loyalty meant more than birth or titles. Eventually the lords stood, but the mood had changed. Jon could feel it in the way they looked at him now. They were no longer just allies or soldiers. They were subjects, and they were waiting for their king to lead them. Later that night, after the hall had emptied and the lords had returned to their chambers, Jon walked through the quiet corridors of Winterfell with Sansa beside him. The castle felt different now that it was back in Stark hands. The torches burned warmly along the stone walls, and servants moved through the halls again, cleaning and repairing what the Boltons had damaged. Yet there was still a heavy silence hanging over everything. Sansa finally spoke. She told Jon that the Northern lords needed someone to believe in. After years of war, betrayal, and fear, they wanted a leader who would protect them. Jon admitted that he did not feel like a king. He had never wanted power. He had only wanted to defend the North and stop Ramsay Bolton. Sansa understood that, but she reminded him that sometimes people are chosen for leadership even when they do not want it. As they turned a corner in the corridor, two guards stood beside a heavy wooden door. Jon immediately knew who was behind it. Ramsay Bolton. Jon paused for a moment before pushing the door open. The room inside was dimly lit, with only a few torches burning on the walls. Ramsay sat chained to a chair in the center of the room. His face was bruised, and dried blood marked the edge of his lip, but there was still that familiar look of twisted confidence in his eyes. When Ramsay saw Jon enter, he gave a slow smile. He commented that rumors spread quickly in a castle like Winterfell. Apparently, he had already heard that the Northern lords had declared Jon their king. Ramsay laughed quietly and said it was almost funny that a bastard had taken everything from the great House Bolton. Jon did not smile. He simply walked closer and looked down at the man who had caused so much pain to the North and to his family. Ramsay began speaking again, mocking Jon and claiming that ruling the North would destroy him. According to Ramsay, the North was a cruel place where loyalty could disappear overnight. Kings rose and fell quickly in such a land. Jon listened silently, but he did not react to the insults. After a moment, he simply told Ramsay that his time was over. The Boltons had ruled through fear and cruelty, but that rule had ended on the battlefield. Ramsay leaned back in his chair and asked what Jon planned to do with him. His voice sounded almost curious, as if he were still playing some kind of game. Jon looked at Sansa. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Sansa stepped forward slowly. Her eyes were cold in a way Jon had never seen before, shaped by everything she had suffered at Ramsay's hands. She told Ramsay that his house was finished, his army destroyed, and his name would disappear from the north. Ramsay tried to laugh again, but this time it sounded weaker. Sansa calmly explained that his own dogs had not been fed in days. For the first time, real fear appeared in Ramsay Bolton's eyes. Jon watched quietly as the guards dragged Ramsay away toward the kennels beneath the castle. He did not follow. Some justice did not need witnesses. When the door closed again, the room felt strangely empty. Sansa stood silently for a moment before turning to leave. Jon followed her back into the hallway, where the cold night air drifted through the narrow windows. Just as they began walking toward the courtyard, a horn suddenly sounded at the main gate. Both of them stopped. Moments later, a guard hurried down the corridor, breathing heavily. He explained that a rider had arrived from the south, carrying an urgent message sealed with the mark of a powerful house. Jon frowned as the guard handed him the scroll. The wax seal was unmistakable. The symbol of the Lannisters. Jon broke the seal slowly and read the message. As his eyes moved across the parchment, his expression grew darker. Sansa noticed immediately. She asked what the letter said. Jon lowered the parchment and looked toward the cold northern sky beyond the castle walls. Then he spoke quietly. The queen in the south had heard about the rise of the new king in the north, and she was not pleased. The cold morning light slowly spread across Winterfell as the castle woke from a restless night. Snow had fallen again, covering the battlefield outside the walls with a clean white blanket, as if the land itself wanted to hide the memory of the slaughter that had taken place there. Smoke rose from the chimneys, and soldiers moved through the courtyard preparing for another hard northern day. But inside the castle, tension was growing. The letter from the south had changed the mood of everyone who had heard about it. Jon Snow stood in the solar with Sansa and a few trusted advisors, the parchment still resting on the table between them. The message had been simple but heavy with warning. Queen Cersei Lannister had heard that the Northern Lords had crowned a new king in the north. According to the letter, the north was still part of the Seven Kingdoms, and any man calling himself king was challenging the Iron Throne. The message demanded that Jon travel south to swear loyalty or prepare for the consequences. The words were polite on the surface, but the threat behind them was clear. Tormund Giantsbane leaned against the wall with his arms crossed, clearly unimpressed by southern politics. He muttered that the south had always been full of kings who believed they owned lands they had never even seen. To him, the north belonged to the people who lived and fought there. Many of the northern lords in the room agreed quietly, but the situation was more complicated than simple pride. The war with the Boltons had already weakened the north, and another war against the Iron Throne could bring disaster. Sansa studied the letter carefully before speaking. She reminded everyone that Cersei Lannister was not the only player in the south anymore. News traveled slowly, but rumors had already begun spreading about another powerful figure gathering strength across the narrow sea. A young queen with dragons was said to be preparing an invasion. If those rumors were true, the southern kingdoms might soon be fighting each other again. That chaos could either protect the north or drag them into an even larger war. Jon listened quietly, but his thoughts were not focused on southern queens or thrones made of swords. His mind kept returning to something else, something far more dangerous. The Night King. After the meeting ended, Jon left the room and walked along the walls of Winterfell again. The wind was colder today, biting through his cloak as he stared toward the distant northern horizon. Beyond those mountains and forests stood the wall. Beyond the wall waited the army of the dead. Jon had seen them with his own eyes. He had fought them. He knew the threat was real, even if most of the world still believed it was nothing more than an old legend. Footsteps approached behind him again. This time it was Davos Seaworth, who had quietly become one of Jon's most trusted advisors. The older man stood beside him and followed his gaze toward the distant north. Davos admitted that he had seen many wars in his life, but the fear Jon spoke about when it came to the White Walkers was different. It was not the fear of losing a battle. It was the fear of losing the entire world. Jon nodded slowly and explained that every king and queen in the south was fighting for power, land, or pride. But none of those things would matter if the dead crossed the wall. The real war was coming, and most of the world was too busy arguing to notice. Later that afternoon, the gates of Winterfell opened again to allow a group of riders inside. Their cloaks carried the symbol of House Mormont. At their center rode a scout who had been sent north weeks earlier to gather information from the remaining watch posts near the wall. The man looked exhausted, his horse nearly collapsing from the long ride. He was brought directly to Jon. The scout's face was pale, and his voice shook slightly as he reported what he had seen. According to the remaining brothers of the Night's Watch, strange movements had been spotted far beyond the wall. Entire forests had gone silent. Villages of wildlings had disappeared overnight. And worst of all, large groups of undead creatures had been seen marching south together. The Night King's army was growing. The room fell silent as the scout finished speaking. Even the strongest northern lords felt the weight of those words. Jon closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the truth he had feared finally becoming reality. The battle against Ramsay Bolton had only been the beginning. The real enemy was not a cruel lord sitting in a castle. It was something ancient, something unstoppable, something that did not care about crowns or kingdoms. Jon opened his eyes again and looked at the gathered leaders of the north. His voice was calm but serious as he told them the truth. War was coming again. But this time, it would not be a war between houses or kings. This time, it would be a war between the living and the dead. And if the North was going to survive, they would need more than just northern armies. They would need allies, even from the south. They would need dragons if the rumors were true. For the first time since being crowned, Jon Snow began to realize that becoming king in the North might only be the first step towards something much bigger. Because the fate of the entire world might soon rest on the shoulders of the bastard who refused to stay dead. The news from the walls spread through Winterfell like a cold wind that refused to stop blowing. Soldiers whispered about it in the courtyards, servants spoke quietly in the kitchens, and the northern lords gathered in tense groups inside the halls. Everyone knew that if the reports were true, the danger was far greater than anything they had faced before. Ramsay Bolton had been cruel and ruthless, but he was still only a man. The army marching in the far north was something else entirely. Jon Snow spent the next few days meeting with every lord who had come to support House Stark. They gathered again inside the great hall, where the torches burned late into the night, while maps were spread across the heavy wooden tables. Jon listened carefully as each lord shared their thoughts. Some believed the reports about the dead were exaggerated stories told by frightened scouts. Others had heard similar rumors over the years and feared that the legends of the White Walkers might truly be returning. Tormund Giantsbane stood before the table at one point and spoke with complete certainty. The wildlings had lived beyond the wall for generations, and they knew the truth better than anyone. He reminded the northern lords that thousands of his people had already fled south because they had seen the dead with their own eyes. Villages had vanished in a single night. Entire clans had been wiped out. The enemy marching in the north did not need food, sleep, or warmth. It only needed death. The room grew quiet as his words sank in. Sansa watched Jon closely during these meetings. She could see the struggle inside him. Jon had just been named king in the north, and already he was being forced to make decisions that could shape the future of the entire realm. One evening, after the lords had left and the hall was finally empty, Sansa approached him quietly. She asked him what he planned to do next. Jon stood near the large map of Westeros spread across the table. His hand rested on the northern edge where the wall had been drawn in thick black ink. After a long moment, he admitted something that surprised even him. He needed dragons. Sansa raised an eyebrow slightly, but did not laugh. She had heard the same rumors that had spread through the realm, stories of a young queen across the sea who had brought 3 dragons back into the world. Some people believed the stories were exaggerated, but enough reports had reached Westeros that they could not be ignored. Jon explained that fire was one of the few things known to destroy the White Walkers and their armies. If the North was going to survive the coming war, they needed every weapon they could find. That meant reaching out to the one ruler who might actually have the power to stop the Night King. But there was a problem. Daenerys Targaryen was also a conqueror. She had already begun moving toward Westeros to claim the Iron Throne. If Jon went to meet her, he would not be speaking only as a man asking for help. He would be speaking as a king. And kings often demanded loyalty in return for their support. Sansa understood the danger immediately. She warned Jon that traveling south could be risky. The North had only just regained its independence. If Jon bent the knee to a southern queen, many of the northern lords might see it as a betrayal. Jon did not answer right away. He walked slowly around the table, his thoughts heavy. Finally, he said something that showed just how serious the situation had become. Crowns would not matter if the dead won. If the Night King reached the lands south of the Wall, every kingdom would fall one by one. The Iron Throne would mean nothing in a world ruled by death. If bending the knee to Daenerys meant saving the living, Jon was willing to consider it. Meanwhile, far beyond Winterfell, dark clouds gathered in the frozen wilderness beyond the Wall. The ancient forests stood silent beneath the snow, their branches frozen like the fingers of old ghosts. In that endless white landscape, a massive army was slowly moving forward. Thousands of dead soldiers marched together without sound. At their front rode a tall figure with pale blue eyes that glowed like frozen stars. The Night King. He guided his undead army across the frozen lands, leaving behind only silence and death. Every fallen creature joined the growing force behind him. Wildlings, animals, and even ancient giants now marched as part of his terrible army. Ahead of them stood the Wall, the massive barrier of ice that had protected the realms of men for thousands of years. But the Night King was no longer simply waiting in the darkness. He was coming for it. Back in Winterfell, Jon Snow made his final decision during another gathering of the Northern Lords. Standing before them, he explained that he would travel south to meet Daenerys Targaryen. Some lords looked uncertain, others frustrated, but Jon made it clear that the survival of the North required allies and powerful weapons. He would sail to Dragonstone and speak with the Dragon Queen himself. Because the war for the throne could wait. The war for the living could not. And far away in the frozen north, the Night King's army continued marching toward the Wall, preparing to change the fate of the entire world forever. The preparations for Jon Snow's journey south began quickly after his decision was announced. Winterfell had barely recovered from the battle against the Boltons, yet another important mission was already unfolding. The Northern Lords gathered once more in the courtyard as horses were prepared and supplies were loaded. The cold wind carried the sound of armor and restless horses as Jon's small group made ready to travel. It would not be a large army. Jon knew that arriving with too many soldiers could make Daenerys Targaryen see him as a threat instead of an ally. Sansa stood beside him near the gates of Winterfell as the final preparations were completed. The two siblings looked out at the snow-covered lands stretching beyond the castle walls. Their home had finally been taken back from their enemies, yet Jon was already leaving again. Sansa understood why, but that did not make it easier. She reminded him to be careful in the south, where loyalty often changed as quickly as the wind. Jon promised that he would return as soon as possible. Before mounting his horse, he told Sansa that Winterfell and the North would be safer in her hands while he was gone. With that, Jon rode south with a small group that included Davos Seaworth, a few trusted northern guards, and several riders sent to guide them safely through the lands still damaged by years of war. Tormund and the wildlings remained behind to help strengthen the North's defenses. If the army of the dead truly reached the wall, someone needed to be ready. The journey south took many days. The landscape slowly changed as Jon and his companions rode farther from the frozen lands of the north. The heavy snow faded into colder rains, and the forests grew thicker and darker. Along the way, they passed villages still struggling to recover from the chaos of past wars. Many people stared at Jon's banner with curiosity when they realized the king in the north was riding through their lands. But Jon's thoughts were not focused on the people watching him. Every night, he looked toward the north before sleeping, wondering how much time remained before the true war began. Eventually, the group reached the eastern coast, where ships waited to carry them across the sea. The water was rough and gray as the wind pushed the ships southward along the coast of Westeros. Days later, a massive dark shape appeared on the horizon. Dragonstone. The ancient fortress rose from the sea like a giant black mountain. Its tall towers and sharp stone shapes made it look almost alive. Smoke drifted from the volcanic rock surrounding the island, and the waves crashed loudly against the cliffs below. As Jon's ship sailed closer, the guards on deck pointed toward the sky. A shadow passed over the water. Jon looked up just in time to see an enormous dragon flying high above the island. Its wings stretched wider than the sails of a ship, and its dark scales shimmered as it circled the castle towers. Even from far below, the power of the creature was impossible to ignore. Another dragon soon appeared, gliding through the clouds beside the first. Their deep roars echoed across the sea. Davos shook his head slowly in disbelief. He muttered that he had spent most of his life believing dragons were nothing more than old stories told to children. Now they were flying directly above them. When the ship finally reached the docks of Dragonstone, Jon and his companions stepped onto the stone pier, surrounded by soldiers wearing the colors of Daenerys Targaryen's forces. Unsullied warriors stood silently in perfect formation, while Dothraki riders watched from the cliffs above. Jon could feel many eyes studying him as he walked toward the entrance of the castle. But before he could reach the gates, something unexpected happened. A loud roar shook the air. One of the dragons suddenly swooped down from the sky, landing on the cliffs nearby with a thunderous crash. The massive creature folded its wings slowly while its glowing eyes fixed directly on Jon. The guards around him froze. Davos whispered nervously that this might not be a good sign. But Jon did not move. For some strange reason, the dragon did not look angry. Instead, it stepped closer to the edge of the cliff and lowered its massive head slightly, as if studying him. The air felt heavy and tense as everyone watched. Then the dragon gave a deep rumbling sound that almost felt like recognition. High above the castle towers, the second dragon circled again and let out another powerful roar. Inside Dragonstone, Daenerys Targaryen had already been told that the king in the north had arrived. But even she did not yet know that her dragons were reacting to Jon Snow in a very unusual way. And far beyond the wall, the Night King's army continued its silent march south, bringing the world closer and closer to the greatest war it had ever seen. The tension near the cliff slowly faded as the dragon lifted its head again and spread its enormous wings. With a powerful push, the creature rose back into the air and circled the castle once more before flying toward the clouds above Dragonstone. The soldiers standing near Jon exchanged uneasy looks, clearly unsure how to react to what they had just witnessed. Dragons did not usually show curiosity toward strangers, especially not in such a calm way. Davos quietly muttered that he had seen many strange things in his life, but a dragon greeting a man like an old friend was something entirely new. Soon after, Jon and his companions were escorted through the massive stone gates of Dragonstone. The castle felt ancient and powerful, with dark walls carved into shapes of dragons and twisted stone beasts. Torches burned along the long corridors, casting flickering shadows across the dragon-shaped pillars. The air smelled faintly of smoke and salt from the sea. As they walked deeper into the castle, Jon could sense the eyes of Daenerys' followers watching him closely. Unsullied guards stood silently along the walls, while several Dothraki warriors leaned against the pillars, observing the Northern King with curiosity. Finally, the group entered the large throne room of Dragonstone. At the far end of the hall stood the tall stone throne carved in the shape of a dragon's wings. Sitting there was Daenerys Targaryen, the woman who had crossed the sea with an army, dragons, and the dream of reclaiming the Iron Throne. Her silver hair fell over her shoulders, and her calm but sharp gaze immediately settled on Jon as he walked forward. Standing beside her was Tyrion Lannister, who watched the scene carefully with the thoughtful expression he always seemed to carry. The hall was silent, except for the distant crashing of waves against the cliffs outside. Jon stopped a few steps from the throne while Davos stood beside him. Tyrion stepped forward slightly and formally introduced Jon as the king in the north. He then turned to Daenerys and spoke about the long war that had taken place in the north, explaining how Jon had defeated the Boltons and reclaimed Winterfell. Daenerys listened patiently, but her expression remained serious. When Tyrion finished speaking, she leaned forward slightly and spoke in a calm but firm voice. She reminded Jon that the Seven Kingdoms belonged under one ruler, and that ruler was her. She had come to Westeros to reclaim her family's throne, and every lord and king in the land would eventually need to choose whether to support her or oppose her. Jon met her gaze without lowering his eyes. He had expected this conversation from the moment he decided to travel south. He explained that he had not come to Dragonstone to argue about thrones or power. The reason for his journey was far more important than any crown. The room grew quiet again as Jon began to describe the threat beyond the wall. He spoke about the White Walkers and the army of the dead marching south. He described what he had seen with his own eyes, the cold blue eyes of the Night King, the endless soldiers that rose again every time they were killed, and the growing silence spreading across the lands beyond the wall. At first, some of the people in the hall looked doubtful. The story sounded like something taken from old legends rather than a real danger. But Jon continued speaking with steady seriousness, explaining how the Night's Watch had already confirmed the sightings and how the wildlings had fled south to escape the coming army. Tyrion listened very carefully. His face slowly grew more thoughtful as Jon spoke. When Jon finished, Tyrion glanced toward Daenerys, clearly believing there was some truth in what he had heard. Daenerys remained silent for a moment, considering everything. Finally, she stood from the throne and slowly walked down the steps toward Jon. She studied him closely, as if trying to understand the man standing before her. Then she said something unexpected. She mentioned the strange behavior of her dragon earlier. Her soldiers had already told her how the creature had approached Jon without aggression. Dragons were known to sense things that humans could not. She asked Jon a simple question. Who were his parents? Jon looked slightly uncomfortable. He had lived his entire life believing he was the bastard son of Ned Stark, raised in Winterfell but never truly belonging. He explained that his mother's identity had always been a mystery, something Ned Stark had never spoken about. As Jon finished explaining, Tyrion slowly stepped forward again. There was a thoughtful look in his eyes, as if a puzzle was beginning to form in his mind. He quietly pointed out that dragons reacting calmly to Jon might not be a coincidence. Because in the long history of the world, dragons had always shown loyalty to only one bloodline. The blood of House Targaryen. Jon frowned slightly, unsure what Tyrion was suggesting. But Daenerys looked even more curious now. Somewhere deep in the ancient halls of Dragonstone, a secret long hidden in the past was beginning to stir. A truth that could change the fate of kings, queens, and the entire war that was coming. And far in the frozen north, the Night King's army was finally approaching the wall itself. The moment that could decide the future of the living world was drawing closer with every passing day. The Hall of Dragonstone remained silent after Tyrion's words. The idea that Jon Snow could somehow be connected to the blood of the Targaryens sounded impossible to most of the people in the room. Jon himself looked confused, almost uncomfortable, as if the thought did not belong to him at all. For his entire life, he had believed he was simply the unwanted bastard of Winterfell. The name Snow had followed him everywhere, reminding him that he did not truly belong among the noble Stark children. Hearing someone suggest that he might carry the blood of dragon lords felt unreal. Daenerys studied Jon carefully as he stood before her. The dragons circling above Dragonstone could still be heard roaring faintly in the distance, their cries echoing through the open windows of the castle. She had lived with dragons long enough to understand that they rarely behaved without reason. They sensed blood, power, and ancient connections that ordinary people could not see. The way her dragon had approached Jon earlier was not something she could easily ignore. Tyrion broke the silence by speaking again, though his voice was calm and thoughtful rather than dramatic. He explained that the histories of Westeros were filled with secrets and forgotten truths. Many important stories had been buried during the chaos of past wars. If Jon's mother had truly been unknown all these years, there was a chance that the truth might have been hidden for a reason. Jon shook his head slightly. He said that Ned Stark had been an honorable man who valued truth more than anything. If there had been something important about Jon's birth, surely Ned would have told him. Tyrion gently reminded him that sometimes even honorable men keep secrets when they believe it is the only way to protect someone. Before the conversation could continue further, the heavy doors of the hall suddenly opened and one of Daenerys' messengers rushed inside. The man looked exhausted from travel, his cloak covered in sea spray and dust from a long journey. He quickly knelt before the queen and presented a sealed message. Daenerys broke the seal and began reading. As her eyes moved across the parchment, her expression slowly changed from calm curiosity to serious concern. She handed the letter to Tyrion, who read it just as carefully. The room remained silent as he finished. The message had come from the north. From the wall. Jon immediately stepped forward, sensing something terrible in their reactions. Tyrion looked up and explained what the message said. The Night's Watch had reported a massive attack against the wall. Thousands upon thousands of undead creatures had gathered in the frozen wilderness beyond the barrier. The Night King himself had been seen leading the army. The defenders of the wall were holding their positions for now, but the pressure was growing stronger every day. Even worse, the message contained another frightening detail. The Night King had something new. A weapon powerful enough to threaten the wall itself. The room fell completely silent. Jon felt a cold wave pass through him as he imagined the massive ice wall that had stood for thousands of years, finally facing its greatest test. The wall had protected the realms of men since ancient times, but if the Night King truly had a way to break it, then the entire world south of it would soon be exposed. Daenerys slowly walked toward the large stone map table in the center of the room. She looked down at the carved shapes representing the lands of Westeros. The north stretched wide and cold across the map, with the wall marking the final border between the living world and the frozen unknown. For the first time since Jon had arrived, the Iron Throne no longer seemed like the most important thing in the room. Daenerys finally spoke with quiet seriousness. She admitted that if the threat Jon described was real, then the war for the throne might have to wait. No queen could rule a kingdom of dead men. Tyrion nodded in agreement. He suggested that the best way to confirm the danger would be to see it with their own eyes. If they could capture proof of the undead army and show it to the southern rulers, even the most stubborn kings and queens might be forced to unite against the threat. Jon knew such a mission would be extremely dangerous. It would require traveling beyond the wall itself. But if it convinced the world to prepare for the coming war, it might be worth the risk. Above Dragonstone, the dragons continued circling through the darkening sky as if they could already sense the storm that was approaching the world. And far away in the frozen north, the Night King stood before the towering wall of ice. Behind him stretched an endless army of the dead. The moment that had been feared for thousands of years was finally beginning. The wind howled across the frozen lands beyond the wall as Jon Snow and a small group of warriors pushed deeper into the endless white wilderness. The sky above them was grey and heavy, and the snow beneath their boots creaked with every step. Jon had gathered only a handful of fighters for this mission, men he trusted with his life. Among them were Tormund Giantsbane, who had traveled south to join Jon again, the Hound, who had little patience for cold weather but even less patience for the dead, and several brave members of the Brotherhood without banners. Their task was simple in words but terrifying in reality: find proof of the army of the dead and bring it back alive, or at least bring back something that once had been alive. Every man in the group understood the danger. Beyond the wall, the rules of the world were different. The forests felt too quiet, and the cold seemed deeper than anywhere else in the realm. As they marched across frozen hills and silent valleys, they passed abandoned wildling camps that had clearly been deserted in a hurry. Broken tools, scattered bones, and cold fire pits told the story of people who had run for their lives, but running had not saved many of them. Jon spotted the first sign of the dead near a frozen river. Half buried in the snow were several bodies that had clearly been torn apart. Their skin was pale and frozen, and their eyes were empty. The men around Jon exchanged uneasy looks. Tormund muttered that the Night King's army had passed through this place not long ago. They continued moving north, careful and quiet. The plan was to find a small group of undead creatures separated from the larger army. If they could capture one and return with it to Dragonstone, it would be undeniable proof for every lord and queen in Westeros. But the deeper they went, the stranger the land began to feel. The air grew colder, almost unnaturally cold, and the wind seemed to carry faint whispers through the trees. Even the animals had disappeared. It felt like walking through a world where life itself had been chased away. After hours of careful searching, they finally saw movement in the distance. A small group of undead figures stumbled slowly across a frozen clearing between the trees. Their movements were stiff and unnatural, their pale skin glowing faintly under the grey sky. Jon raised his hand, signaling the group to stop. This was their chance. The men quietly spread out, surrounding the clearing as carefully as possible. When Jon gave the signal, they rushed forward together with weapons raised. The fight was quick but brutal. Steel cut through frozen flesh as the undead creatures fought without fear or pain. One by one, they were destroyed, their bodies collapsing into lifeless piles. All except one. Jon and the others managed to trap a single wight using chains and hooks. The creature snarled and struggled violently, its glowing blue eyes filled with cold hatred. Even restrained, it tried to bite and claw at them like a wild animal. But they had done it. They had captured proof. Relief spread through the group, but it did not last long. Suddenly, the temperature seemed to drop even further. The wind stopped completely, leaving the clearing in an eerie silence. Jon slowly looked toward the distant hills. And then he saw them. At the top of a frozen ridge stood several tall figures on pale horses. White walkers. Behind them, stretching across the horizon like a dark tide, was the full army of the dead. Thousands upon thousands of wights stood motionless in the snow. At the center of the ridge stood a single tall figure wearing dark armor made of ice. The Night King. His glowing blue eyes locked onto Jon from across the distance. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the Night King slowly raised one hand. The frozen ground around the clearing suddenly began to tremble. All around Jon's group, the bodies buried beneath the snow started to move. Dead wildlings, animals, and ancient skeletons clawed their way out of the ice as the Night King's power spread across the land. The men realized they had walked into a trap. The entire army of the dead began moving toward them. The group quickly formed a defensive circle while dragging the captured wight with them. They fought desperately as more and more undead creatures poured into the clearing. Steel clashed against frozen bones while arrows flew through the air. But the numbers were overwhelming. Just when it seemed like they might be surrounded completely, a loud roar echoed through the sky. Everyone looked up. Three massive shapes burst through the clouds above the battlefield. Daenerys Targaryen's dragons had arrived. Their wings thundered through the air as they dove toward the army of the dead, breathing streams of fire that lit the frozen battlefield like a rising sun. For the first time, the army of the dead began to burn. But the Night King did not look afraid. Instead, he slowly reached behind him and lifted something from the ground. A long spear made entirely of ice. The weapon glowed faintly with cold blue light. And as the dragons flew lower over the battlefield, the Night King pulled back his arm and prepared to throw. The fate of the war was about to change forever. The Night King's icy spear cut through the air faster than any arrow or bolt Jon had ever seen. Its sharp tip glimmered under the grey sky, leaving a streak of frozen light as it flew toward one of Daenerys' dragons. Jon's heart froze. The dragon roared in warning, twisting midair, but the spear struck true. Fire met ice in a terrible explosion, and the beast let out a scream that echoed across the snow-covered plains. Jon's companions froze, watching in horror as their hope, the dragons, were now in immediate danger. Tormund shouted for everyone to hold their ground, but even his booming voice seemed swallowed by the cold silence that followed the blast. The Night King advanced slowly, his army moving behind him like a wave of death, their numbers endless. Jon knew that fighting without the dragons was now a nearly impossible task. Every wight and every fallen creature seemed drawn to the magic that the Night King carried, their icy blue eyes glowing with anticipation. Jon gritted his teeth and grabbed his sword, knowing that the coming battle would test not only his strength, but every decision that had led him here. The captured wight in their chains writhed violently, as if sensing the presence of its master, and Jon realized that this single creature might hold more than proof. It might hold a clue to stopping the Night King. Suddenly, another roar split the sky, and Jon looked up to see the second dragon swoop low, circling above the undead army, flames lashing out in every direction. The heat momentarily slowed the advance of the dead, but it was clear that fire alone would not be enough. The Night King raised his hands again, and the icy wind swirled around him like a living shield. The frozen spear, already thrown, seemed insignificant compared to the growing power radiating from the figure at the center of the army. Even the dragon's fire flickered, as though struggling against a force far older and stronger than anything Jon had imagined. Jon's mind raced. He knew that to survive, he could not fight the Night King alone. Every strategy he had relied on in the past, cavalry charges, careful defense, the courage of men, felt useless against this force, and yet he could not retreat. If the Night King reached the wall and broke through, the north and all of Westeros would fall. He had no choice but to press forward, to find a way to strike at the Night King himself. "Jon," Davos shouted, pulling him back from the edge of the clearing. "We need to retreat with the White. If we lose it, no one will believe what's coming." Jon nodded grimly, realizing that the White they carried might be the only chance to prove the danger to Daenerys and her allies. He motioned for Tormund and the others to form a tight circle around the creature. The cold wind whipped at his face as he prepared to move, but even as they began retreating, Jon's eyes stayed locked on the Night King. There was intelligence in those icy blue eyes, a cruel understanding of every move they made, and Jon knew he had to find a weakness before it was too late. The dragons roared again, flying closer to distract the Night King, their shadows casting over the endless horde of undead. The Night King raised his hand, and another surge of icy wind blasted across the battlefield, sending the remaining wights tumbling. Jon realized that brute force alone would not win this fight. He would have to rely on speed, cunning, and something more he had yet to understand. His thoughts returned to Dragonstone and the rumors Tyrion had whispered, the dragon blood, the strange recognition from Daenerys' creatures, the possibility that his own lineage might hold the key to surviving this war. With the White chained at the center of their group, Jon led the desperate retreat across the frozen tundra. The Night King's army advanced relentlessly, yet the dragons kept striking with fire, buying them precious time. Every step was a struggle, each breath colder and heavier than the last, but Jon pressed onward. The weight of the North, the hope of the living, and the memory of those who had already fallen all drove him forward. Above him, the shadow of death hovered in the sky, But Jon Snow understood one terrifying truth. Victory would demand more than courage. It would demand the kind of sacrifice that legends were made of. The frozen wind bit at Jon Snow's face as he led his small group across the icy plains, every muscle tense, every step measured. Behind them, the Night King's army stretched endlessly, an unstoppable tide of death that seemed to erase the horizon itself. The white in their chains thrashed violently, its glowing blue eyes fixed on its master, as if sensing the cold, ancient power radiating from the distant figure at the ridge. Jon's heart pounded with a mix of fear and determination. He knew that if the Night King reached the wall and broke through, Winterfell, the North, and all of Westeros would be consumed. He gritted his teeth, realizing that the fate of the living rested on a knife's edge, and every decision from this moment forward could be the difference between life and annihilation. As they pressed on, the snow beneath their boots turned slick with frozen ice and the remnants of previous skirmishes. Jon's mind kept returning to Dragonstone, the dragons, Daenerys, and the strange recognition they had shown him. There had been something in their eyes, a moment of hesitation and curiosity that suggested he was not an ordinary man. Tyrion's hints about Jon's true parentage had planted a seed in his mind, one that now gnawed at him with urgency. Could his blood, some hidden Targaryen heritage, be the key to fighting the Night King? Could it give him a strength he had yet to understand? There was little time to ponder. The army behind them moved with frightening speed, relentless and patient, unyielding as ice itself. Suddenly, one of the scouts riding slightly ahead of Jon shouted a warning. From the ridge above, the Night King had raised his icy spear once more, this time aimed at the remaining dragons circling the sky. Jon's eyes followed the gleaming weapon as it streaked toward the creature, faster than the eye could track. The dragon twisted midair, flames roaring from its mouth, but the spear grazed its wing, sending a thunderous cry across the plains. Jon felt a cold, dread claw at his chest. The dragons were the only advantage the living had over the dead, and even they were vulnerable to the Night King's unnatural power. He pushed forward, barking orders to his group, urging them to keep the white secure while maintaining their retreat. Tormund Giantsbane shouted encouragements, rallying the men even as another wave of undead surged toward them, their frozen limbs snapping through the snow with mechanical precision. Jon realized that even the best warriors among them were no match for sheer numbers. They needed more than skill. They needed a plan that could exploit the one weakness of an enemy that seemed invincible. In the middle of the retreat, Jon caught a glimpse of the white they carried. Its frozen face twisted in rage, but its eyes flickered with a strange light, almost as if it remembered life. Jon's mind raced. If this creature had once been human, could its lingering connection to life provide a clue to stopping the Night King? He remembered the legends of dragonglass and Valyrian steel, ancient weapons with the power to kill the dead. But there had to be more. He felt, deep within, that his own blood, unknown, mysterious, perhaps tied to the Dragon Lords, might hold the key to surviving the coming war. Above them, the dragons descended once more, flames carving arcs through the frozen sky. The Night King raised his hand again, and a surge of icy wind swept over the plains, scattering snow and sending men stumbling. The army of the dead continued its march, relentless as ever, yet Jon did not falter. He tightened his grip on his sword and shouted commands to the men around him. Each step was a battle, each breath a fight against despair. He could see Winterfell far to the south, the north he had sworn to protect, and the stakes crystallized sharply in his mind. Victory would require more than courage. It would demand every ounce of cunning, every shred of loyalty, and perhaps a truth he was only beginning to understand about himself. Jon glanced briefly toward the distant ridge, where the Night King waited, calm and unyielding. His glowing blue eyes seemed to pierce Jon's very soul, searching, testing, waiting for the moment to strike. And in that instant, Jon realized that this war was not just a fight between life and death. It was a test of destiny itself. If he could survive, if he could lead, if he could awaken something within himself that he had never known, then there might be hope. But if he failed, everything, the North, the Seven Kingdoms, and all of the living world, would fall. The ground shook faintly under the massive march of the undead. Jon tightened his grip on Longclaw, the Valyrian steel sword that had saved him more times than he could count. His mind flashed with visions of Winterfell, Dragonstone, and the dragons above. The moment to confront the Night King was coming, and Jon Snow understood with a cold certainty that the outcome would shape the fate of all men. There was no turning back. The living and the dead were about to collide, and the first decisive clash of this war would decide who truly belonged in a world threatened by ice, fire, and the unknown power hidden in his very blood. The snow whipped across the frozen plains as Jon Snow's group pressed on, the wind carrying an unnatural chill that seemed to seep into their bones. Every step forward was a struggle against the ice and exhaustion, but Jon's mind was fixed on the distant ridge where the Night King waited, his glowing blue eyes unblinking and unyielding. The undead army advanced steadily, endless and silent, like a living glacier moving toward them. Jon knew the retreat alone would not be enough. At some point, he would have to confront the Night King, and soon. He tightened his grip on Longclaw, feeling the familiar weight of Valyrian steel in his hands, the metal's cold hum giving him a strange sense of resolve. As they neared a small ridge, the first wave of white surged forward, forcing Jon's group to form a defensive line. Steel clashed against icy limbs, screams echoed across the frozen landscape, and snow turned red with the blood of the fallen. Tormund roared beside him, hacking through a group of undead with his massive axe, while Davos used the white in their chains as bait, trying to keep the rest of the horde distracted. Jon moved methodically, every strike precise, every step calculated, yet even as they fought, the sense of something greater watching them pressed down. It wasn't just the Night King. It was the cold, ancient magic radiating from him, and Jon felt it reach into him, testing his courage, his strength, and something else he didn't yet understand, something buried deep in his own blood. Suddenly, one of the whites broke free from its chains, thrashing violently. Jon lunged forward, swinging Longclaw in a blur of silver, piercing the creature's chest and watching the blue light in its eyes extinguish instantly. He realized then that every movement of the undead was connected, coordinated by the Night King himself. It was no ordinary battle. It was a test of strategy, endurance, and survival. And Jon knew that even dragons, the closest thing the living had to a weapon against such power, could be overwhelmed if the Night King's magic was fully unleashed. Above them, the sky darkened as the dragons swooped low, fire lancing the army in attempts to break the tide. One dragon screamed as another spear of ice from the Night King's hand struck near its wing, sending snow and sparks flying. Jon ducked instinctively, the roar of the beast echoing over the chaos, and a realization struck him with cold clarity. Brute force alone would not defeat this enemy. The Night King's power was ancient, absolute, and tied to something more than steel or fire. Jon felt it coursing through the air, tugging at him, whispering in a voice that was not sound but feeling. And for the first time, he understood Tyrion's hints, Daenerys' dragons, and the strange pull he had always sensed in himself. His blood was different. Something in him responded to the magic of ice and fire in a way no ordinary man could. As the battle continued, Jon pushed forward with renewed determination. Every swing of Longclaw, every command to his companions, was guided by a strange, growing awareness. He noticed that the Night King's gaze lingered on him, almost as if measuring, as if testing the limits of his hidden power. Jon realized that this confrontation was not just about survival, it was about awakening something dormant, something tied to his true heritage. He began to feel a strange warmth in his chest, subtle but undeniable, a connection to the dragons above and the fire that ran through their veins. The realization both terrified and emboldened him. The key to this war, the weapon that could turn the tide, might not be in the steel of swords or the fire of dragons, but in himself. The Night King advanced closer, his army like a frozen wave crashing relentlessly forward. Jon's companions fought valiantly, but the sheer numbers threatened to overwhelm them. He knew that soon he would have no choice but to face the Night King directly. Longclaw felt heavier, not from weight, but from the knowledge that in this moment, it was not just a sword. It was an extension of his resolve, his blood, and the ancient legacy he had only just begun to understand. As he stared into the icy blue eyes of the Night King, Jon felt a strange recognition in return, a silent acknowledgement that their confrontation was inevitable, and that the future of the living rested on what he would do next. The wind howled as Jon Snow stepped forward, Longclaw in hand, facing the Night King at the edge of the frozen ridge. The army of the dead pressed closer, their blue eyes glowing like stars in a world without warmth. Jon felt the pulse of something ancient within him, a power he had never understood until now, the fire in his blood, the dragon fire he had glimpsed in Daenerys' dragons, responding to the cold magic of the Night King. For the first time, Jon realized he was not merely a man of the North. He was the bridge between fire and ice, a force neither the living nor the dead could ignore. The Night King raised his icy spear, and Jon met his gaze, feeling the dragons circling overhead, their roars echoing in perfect harmony with the power awakening inside him. A wave of heat radiated from Jon, strange and unstoppable, melting the ice around him in a flash. The Night King lunged, but Jon's newfound strength guided Longclaw in a sweep of fire and steel. The blade struck true, meeting the Night King's magic with a force that shook the frozen air. Behind him, the whites began to falter as Jon's fire surged outward, lighting the battlefield with an intense blaze that cut through the endless tide of undead. Dragons dove low, breathing fire across the frozen plains, and for the first time, Jon felt the full weight of his bloodline, the combination of Stark resilience and Targaryen fire flowing through him. The Night King staggered under the force, his army faltering, the blue glow in his eyes flickering. Jon's companions fought beside him, inspired by his sudden surge of power, hacking through the undead with renewed vigor. The tide of the battle shifted. Ice met fire, and fire burned brighter than any cold could contain. Finally, with one decisive strike, Jon drove Longclaw into the Night King's chest, the combined fire of dragons and his own awakened bloodline erupting in a brilliant explosion. The icy figure shattered into 1,000 shards, and the army of the dead collapsed instantly, their magical hold broken. Silence followed, thick and heavy, interrupted only by the distant crackle of melting ice and the tired roars of the dragons above. Jon stood among the wreckage, snow and ash swirling around him, feeling every muscle ache, but knowing that the dead would not rise again. The dragons landed beside him, their eyes glowing with approval, circling protectively as Jon looked north toward the wall. The threat that had haunted the North for generations was finally gone, and yet the war for the living had forged him into something more than a king or a warrior. He was the living embodiment of fire and ice, a symbol of hope for a world that had almost been lost. When Jon returned to Dragonstone, Daenerys approached him, awe and respect in her eyes. She no longer saw him as just the king in the north, but as an equal, a leader who had faced the impossible and survived. Together, they planned to unite the kingdoms, rebuild what had been lost, and prepare for the challenges that would inevitably arise in a world still scarred by war. Jon finally understood the truth of his life. He was not bound by the past, nor limited by the expectations of others. He carried both the honor of the Starks and the fire of the Targaryens, and with that power he could protect the North, the Seven Kingdoms, and the living world itself. The war was over, the dead defeated, and a new era began, one forged by fire, ice, and a king who had survived what no one else could. The dragons roared once more, circling the sky as Jon Snow looked out over the lands he had sworn to protect. For the first time in his life, he felt not the weight of loss or doubt, but the quiet, unshakable certainty of destiny fulfilled. The North was safe, the world was alive, and Jon Snow, bastard, king, dragon-blooded hero, had survived to see it all. The end.